1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hi, everybody. My name is Miss Alexi Flores, and I'm presenting to you the power of prevention, how to address sexual exploitation and teach safe exploration. Okay, and we are going to start with the safeguards. A little bit about myself. I am presenting to you via animated advocacy, and I'll give you more information later on that. So we're going to go over the practical implementation of protections against sexual exploitation and addressing emerging sexuality in populations with existing or pre-existing vulnerabilities. So age and cognition is our first slide here. So age and cognition expectations are not the same in the exceptional or non-typical person. So when you talk about something that's age appropriate, it has a completely different meaning when you're talking about a special needs world. Age and cognition do not coalesce. They do not come together in our world. So if you go into the cognition slide, if you're wondering what cognition actually means, it means the ability to acquire, to store, manipulate, and to retrieve information. And all of that plays a large role in our perception of how we understand things. Excuse me, our interpretations of encounters that we have with the world and with other people, our planning, our ability to pre-plan our actions, our attention, our ability to pay attention to details, our ability to recall details, our engagement, our ability to engage with the world around us, our ability to engage with each other and with their own thoughts, the recall of events. And because disabilities typically impact all of that, we are very vulnerable in this population to sexual exploitation or sexual abuse. So go ahead and go to the next slide for me. When we are talking about perception, interpretation, planning, attention, engagement, recall, and vulnerabilities, go ahead and hit it again. We're going to talk about some tools here that are going to help us with this. So at the end of the presentation, you're going to get links to videos, to books, support groups, and you're going to make sure that you have the awareness and the accountability of a typical functioning adult in our society and community. Go ahead and go to the right arrow for me. So again, this is the practical implementation, which means that this is not a full-on class on awareness and accountability of sexual exploitation of those in the special needs community. This is just a very on the surface review. So the next thing that we're going to do is hit the right arrow. And what always is going to come up is that blue circle, which is fine. So we're talking about adults' awareness and accountability. And I love this quote right here by Maya Angelou. It says, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. So once you've finished going through this presentation with me, you're going to be able to do better in our community. Go ahead and hit the right arrow for me. Awareness. Just being aware of what's happening within our population is an incredible tool to have. Go ahead and hit the right arrow for me again. Oops, sorry. Go into awareness. Hit the number 1 with the, there we go. Okay, so the number 1 thing you need to know is that 90% of special needs individuals have or will experience sexual abuse or exploitation. So go ahead and hit, thank you. It'll zoom out and hit the, there we go. Okay, here are some of the disabilities that we are talking about when we're talking about special needs. We're talking about autism, blindness, oops, that's spelled wrong, cerebral palsy, cancer, diabetes, deafness or hard of hearing, Down syndrome, epilepsy, emotional disorders, intellectual disabilities, orthopedic impairment. Is that something that a lot of people don't believe has anything to do with whether or not somebody could be sexually exploited? But that does play a factor in vulnerability. PTSD, especially complex PTSD. And when you're talking about complexity levels of these disabilities, they can range from mild symptoms to pretty severe symptoms, which will also impact their vulnerability to people looking to sexually exploit them or abuse them. Go ahead and hit the button for me. So the number 3 has an X next to it because it's times. If you are a person with a disability, you are 3 times more likely to be sexually exploited or abused. And we're talking about children, teens, and adults. Go ahead and hit the arrow for me. And this little circle we talk about, we talk about the risk factors. So when you are a human with a disability, these are some of the risk factors that typically appear. Low self-esteem, low levels of communication, and that could be a range from not being able to communicate at all to having a difficult time expressing yourself or having the language that you need to use to be able to express that something has happened to you. Oh my Lord, sorry about that. Poor interpersonal relationships. A lot of these diagnoses, everything from autism to Down syndrome to post-traumatic stress disorder, to hard of hearing, any of the disabilities listed and all the ones that are also not listed, they impact how we relate to others. So our interpersonal relationships is also a risk factor when it's poor. Two separate parent households. A lot of people don't know that, but whenever there are two separate parent households, the risk factor for a person with a disability and a typical person goes extremely 3 times actually higher, that they will be either sexually abused or exploited. Introduction of step families. So when you unite as a blended family is also a risk factor. We're talking about not just step parents, but also step siblings and step family attachments to the new family in the household. Low income levels are also a high risk factor. And when you're talking about the special needs population, we have a prevalence to be in the low income bracket. Being considered a Black person, an Indigenous person, or a person of color is also a high risk factor. They are 5 times more likely to be sexually exploited or abused if they are either a Black person, an Indigenous person, or a person of color. Previous sexual violence, that also ups the risk factor for continuous sexual exploitation. Having unmonitored access to technology. So our disability population ranges from somebody who needs to have care all the time, around the clock, to somebody who is pretty independent and only needs certain supports. They may be social and emotional. When we're talking about the level of exploitation in our population, it doesn't vary from somebody who is very low functioning versus somebody who's very high functioning. If they have a disability, they are 3 times more likely to be sexually exploited or abused, regardless of the level of the disability. Unmonitored access to tech is something that a lot of parents with higher functioning children should pay attention to. Loneliness. When we have a disability, it impacts our interpersonal relationships, which then impact our self-esteem. It also makes us lonelier. And that risk factor, especially with partnered with the unmonitored access to tech, makes the vulnerability even higher to sexual exploitation or abuse. If there is a person that has special needs and they consider themselves to be LGBTQ+, there's also a high risk factor for being exploited. Lack of education and sexuality. If there is a person who has no access to sexual education, their risk factor is also now, higher than just if they had only a disability and had some sort of educational and sexuality. Dismissal or trauma responses. So a lot of people that have a disability have symptoms that exhibit themselves in ways that typical people, whether it's their therapists, their parents, their friends, their teachers, they believe them to be symptomatic of their disability. But trauma responses can be easily dismissed that way. And then misunderstanding of consent. When we get older, just because we have aged up, depending on the level of our disability and our cognition and our behavior, it doesn't necessarily mean the older we get, the more we understand what consent is. So these are some of the risk factors that we need to look out for in our population. If we can go to the right arrow for me. Okay, so number 5, we need to be careful about hyper-focusing on these groups. Females, because males are also sexually exploited and abused. Low-functioning individuals, because high-functioning individuals with disabilities are also sexually exploited and abused. We need to be careful with the trending disability du jour, because in our field, there have been times where the industry focuses or hyper focuses on just one specific disability. Stranger danger, people that sexually abuse, assault, or exploit children, 98% of them are somebody that is known to the child. And children, we're hyper focused on just children. All people with disabilities need to be extra protected by us. So if you want to go to the next slide. And then hit the right arrow. The right arrow. Okay. Accountability. So we went over awareness. Now that you're aware that people that have disabilities are 90% likely to be assaulted or abused or exploited in a sexual manner, it's time to be more accountable. So we can do better by spreading awareness. And we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. And how are we going to do that? Is we're going to pay attention to some underlying cultural caveats that endanger our special needs people. The number one thing that I look out for is forcing physical intimacy with a child or an adult that has special needs, with low functioning or a high functioning individual. Intimacy means that there's a closeness there. And when you have a person with a disability who is familiar with another adult, another peer, another coach, whoever they may be in this person's life, and you're forcing them to give physical intimacy, whether it's a hug or a kiss, or allow them to be tickled by somebody or picked up off the ground by another person, you're essentially telling that person with special needs that although they don't want to do that, they have to consent to do something that they don't want to do. If your culture is one where children are seen and not heard, you're increasing the risk of missing the abuse that's happening, or you're increasing the risk of that child being abused because of the fact that in your culture, the children are to be seen and not heard. So they have an overall understanding that their voice does not matter. There are religious beliefs that break down protective barriers. Unless you live under a rock, you're familiar with how many leaders and certain religions have been found guilty of sexual abuse and exploitation of hundreds of children over decades. So if you have a culture in your family that values and holds religious community leaders in high regard, you still need to be very aware that you are not forcing an intimacy between religious leaders and your child, and that you're not turning a blind eye to the possibility that those people could be abusers. Natural trust of community. If overall in your culture, you have well, we're this and we don't sexually abuse kids. I have heard that multiple times. I have heard people say, we are from this culture, and in our culture, we don't do that to children. That's just not seen, especially disabled children. That's disgusting. In every culture and every community, there are sexual exploitation and exploiters and abusers. So there's no such thing as there's a natural trust within our community that there is nobody that is going to hurt my special needs child or my special needs adult. Withholding sexual education, if that's something that's prevalent in your culture, withholding information is a form of abuse in itself, in the sense that if you have a person with disabilities that has the capacity to understand and to be given tools to protect themselves, and you're withholding that from them, you're going to make them more apt to be sexually exploited and abused, and less apt to communicate that to you. Overtly enabling a person with special needs. That happens within some cultures, specifically with male children. Sometimes their feet never touch the ground until they're age 5, 6, or 7. If you are enabling your child's disability symptoms to get progressively more intense by your behavior, because it's part of your culture, understand that your child is not typical, and the cultural norms that apply to typical children will not be applying to your child with disabilities at all times. You can actually place them in danger if you're overtly enabling them. Avoidance of practical conversations with loved ones. At the very top of this list, we have forcing physical intimacy. So say it's the holiday season, because the holiday season's coming up, and you have decided that you're going to put a plan in place to start protecting your child, teen, or adult with special needs. And part of that is teaching them consent to their body. And a safe space to start that is with family and friends. And you want to start implementing that if he doesn't want to kiss you, if she doesn't want to hug, if they don't want to be tickled, then do not do that to them. And you want to start teaching them some protective language, some defensive language. Don't do that. I don't like it. Stop touching me. I don't like that. I don't want to kiss you right now. No, thank you. They can be polite, but they also have to be forceful and executing that command to that person and telling them that they don't want to be touched. A safe space to do that is with family and friends. So you need to have these practical conversations with your family, with your friends, with anybody that's close to your child that typically has free access to your child's body. They are able to come in and just kiss them or tickle them or hug them. They need to have a conversation with you, and you need to clearly communicate to them, this is a plan we're putting in place for little Susie or little Sam, because 90% of children like him are sexually abused or exploited. And I know you don't want that to happen to them. So you're part of this plan. I need you to ask for their consent. Can I hug you? Can I kiss you? Can I shake your hand? And if they say no, as the adult, you need to be aware and accountable for your own reaction and say, okay, no problem, and move on. You need to not press the child or the person to hug you or kiss you or allow you access to their body, because you don't want to confuse anybody with special needs of what intimacy with consent looks like versus intimacy without their consent. They get confused. And then bloodlines that are not cut. If there is suspicion of Uncle so-and-so at some point, or Auntie so-and-so, or someone's cousin, or even somebody who is close to you, like a brother or a parent. If at any point you suspect that they may have possibly shown interest in your disabled child, teen, or adult, and in any appropriate manner, you need to cut those bloodlines. They are no longer part of your family because they have the capacity to abuse or exploit your child when you're not looking. If there's ever been a question in your mind, if there has ever been somebody who has come to you and expressed their concern, you need to take it seriously. And you need to reevaluate whether or not those bloodlines need to be cut to protect your child, your teen, or your adult with disabilities. And we can go to the next slide. And then push the right arrow. So we went over culture and society. We're going to go into experimenting and results, starting an awareness and accountability life plan. And the reason that it's called a life plan is because the disability that your child or your teen or your adult has is for the rest of their life. So this plan needs to be put in place now and needs to be a trial and error of what works and what does not work for you. Specifically, what does or what does not work for your person in your life, whether it's a child, a teen, or an adult with disabilities. So you need to look at your home environment. You need to look at your school environment. You need to look at your work environment or their work environment. You need to do a self-check within the family and within your close friends. And you really need to start assessing who and why should they have free access to my child? Who is going to be allowed into my child's life? And why are they allowed in my child's life like that? Is this something that's necessary? Does this interaction have to happen? So in the home environment, we're talking about things like access to free technology without being supervised. In a family environment, we're talking about who are you leaving your child with? Who's taking care of your child? Who is accessible to your child when you're away from them and they are being watched by family? Who are the people coming over into their space? At school, again, who has access to your student there? Who is their therapist? Who fills in for them? What is the policy when somebody is new to the environment? Does your child communicate to you when somebody is new to their environment? How is your child going to communicate to them that somebody that is new has entered their school environment? And at work, if you're talking about adults that are independent enough to do some type of work activity, they need to be taught what is appropriate in the workspace. And this goes far beyond any HR video that talks about generalities, because those videos are made specifically for neurotypical and typical people. They're not made specifically for humans with disabilities who may have issues with engagement, recall, and all of the other listed risk factors that we went over in the previous slide. What you can do as an adult that's aware now at work is when there is a joke that is told that is slightly sexual in nature, you cannot participate in making it less uncomfortable for somebody to tell that joke again. In other words, you can make them uncomfortable with the fact that they were trying to bring out humor in us that's inappropriate. At no point should we bring up sexual exploitation or possible sexual violence in a lighthearted way, because that does not exist. So we can go to the next slide. So what you're going to do is once you put your plan in, you're going to analyze your results. First, you need to make sure that you identify your values. What are your family values? And then you need to compare those with your cultural values. And you need to really take a deep look, maybe make even a T-bar of the pros and the cons of what hanging on to that value does for your family, and then what hanging on to that value does for your child, your teen, or your adult in your life that has a special need. Repetitive exposure to certain behaviors, repetitive exposure to confusing situations for them. Is it worth hanging on to that family tradition to confuse your child, teen, or adult with special needs? You need to take a really good hard look at what it is that you value and why you value it, and maybe set some things aside moving forward. And then you need to make adjustments to that list. And then you need to apply your plan. The way that you make adjustments is you can bring in people that you want to be part of the plan with you. You can bring in a trusted therapist, a trusted friend. You could bring in your ABA therapist. You can bring in, a coach that you're working with, somebody who you trust to help you make that T-bar of pros and cons of what hanging on to some of those values, specifically that are cultural and specifically that are to your family, how they believe will impact your child, teen, or adult in their life. And, getting somebody's perspective is typically very helpful because they present things to us in a way that we don't look at from the inside out. And then once you've applied your plan, you can analyze your results. How did it work going to Thanksgiving or Friendsgiving and having all the family know in advance? Because I had that practical conversation with them where they have to ask if they could hug my child or if they could tickle my child, where they have to ask if they can give them a hug. How did they react to them saying, no, I don't want to be hugged by you, or no, I don't want to be kissed by you? Or did your child not even understand that they had the consent at that point where they could say, no, thank you, I don't want a hug from you? Look at your plan, analyze it, and see how you could better apply it. And then it's always going to be changing as your child is developing into a teen, as your teen is developing into adult, and as your adult is moving throughout their life trajectory. So go ahead and go to the next slide. We're going to go into a conclusion and discussion phase here, and you're probably wondering why you see a minion with a thong on and Shrek and Fiona kissing. Well, this is part of the discussion, and this is a discussion that I want you to start not just here with me on this webinar, but also with friends and relatives and coworkers, and have some thoughts of your own within yourself. Have some debates as to whether or not you even thought of things like this that could impact or confuse somebody. So every adult has a responsibility now to play a preventative part in the exploitation and sexual abuse of anybody, but specifically people with disabilities. 90% of people with disabilities will be sexually exploited or abused in their lifetime. 90%. And it's preventable. And that's why you're here, because you're going to prevent it from happening by changing your awareness and your accountability. So when we were talking about home environments, this little guy right here, the minion, you could see that his butt is exposed. Everybody's laughing in the theater when they see it, right? And you are giving your child social cues of what's acceptable and what's funny. So instead of getting rid of him and his thong, what we can do is we can use them as an example to open up a conversation with your child, your teen, or your adult. Okay. Why are we all laughing? Because his butt is out. Okay. Well, would it be appropriate for your butt to be out at school? No. Would it be appropriate for anybody to look that way at school? No. What about at the doctor's office? Can you walk around like that? No, I should have a gown on covering my bottom. What about at church? Can somebody do that dress at church? No, of course not. Can somebody at church ask you to expose that part of your body? No. So when you come across things like this, whether it's on social media or animated movies, typically they're made for adults to laugh and chuckle at because we have to sit through a 2-hour long child's animation movie. So then there's things like a minion whose butt's showing, and then Shrek who's hanging upside down like Spider-Man, with Fiona kissing him because that's romantic, right? So they have another scene where Fiona and Shrek are rolling around on the beach together on top of each other. When we laugh at things like that and we don't do a practical social skills implementation of, hey, this is what the norm is for an animated movie, we're missing an opportunity to teach our child or teen or adult, this is what happens in an animation. And if anybody tries to recreate this with you anywhere else, that's not okay. They don't have the consent from you to do that. And when you speak about consent, when you're talking to a child, a teen, or an adult, we're not talking about age appropriate because sometimes age does not coalesce with cognition like we talked about earlier. So you need to address those things at your person's level, at your child, your teen, or your adult's ability to recall the information you're giving them, to actually apply the plan that you're putting in place for them. And then you need to adjust that as they continue to grow. So in conclusion, what I want you to take from this very short webinar and a very on the surface review of how 90% of our population gets sexually exploited or abused is that you need to be aware that it's happening. You need to hold yourself accountable in the sense that now that you have the awareness, you need to look around your environments and see how it is you could possibly prevent one of our children, one of our teens, or one of our adults from being sexually exploited or abused. And at the end, I'm going to be giving you a list of, there we go. Yeah, go ahead and go into that discussion, Jan. It's, yeah, right there. Okay, so here we go. This is the last slide, and this is a discussion you need to have with not just your person with a disability, but with yourself as well. So consent. What are step parents allowed to do with your child? What are step siblings allowed to do with them? What is step family allowed to do with them? What kind of access are you giving them? Are they allowed to just walk into their room? Are you going to ask them to knock? Doctors, therapists, respite workers, transportation workers, your person cannot consent to have any type of sexual activity or exploration with these people. These people are in position of power over your person with a disability. And whether or not they're old enough to say, I like that, I want to do that with you, this is a hard black and white line right here. There is no gray area. These people do not have consent to do anything with you. Even if your body's telling you to, there is no consent here. These are people in position of power, and they are not allowed to engage with you in that way. Coaches, teachers, religious leaders, event organizers. I recently did the Down Syndrome Society walk here in Florida. If I were a participant with a disability and I participated in an event and I decided that I had a crush on one of the event organizers, it's not okay, even if I want to consent, to have a relationship of any kind with the person that is organizing the event. And that needs to be taught. It needs to be communicated to our people. Coaches, teachers, and religious leaders. Those are people of power over us. They cannot have my consent. And then family, friends, aunties, and funkles. I call them funkles because some people have faux uncles, right? And aunties because some people don't have siblings, and they've created a family outside of bloodlines for their child, their teen, or their adult. And you need to understand who are the right people to let into those circles and who are the wrong people to let into those circles. And that could ebb and flow depending on your person's life trajectory. Maybe an auntie was great when they were a child and good when they were a teen, but now that they're an adult, they're not respecting the whole, he does not consent for you to just grab him and kiss him. They need to go. You need to cut ties with whoever is getting in the way of your child, teen, or adult understanding what appropriate consent is. And then you need to name the person. That person is your bus driver. They will never have a relationship with you because they transport you. It's not okay for you to have a relationship with them. That person, that's your teacher. Don't blow them kisses anymore because you're 23 and you're a man and that's a woman and she's an adult as well. You should not be blowing kisses at her anymore. So you need to name the person in their life, what the function of that person is in their life, and where the hard black and white areas are. There's no gray area. Yes, they can drive you to school. No, they can't sit next to you on the bench and touch any part of your body that's covered by your bathing suit. Yes, they can give you the Eucharist. No, you cannot follow them back into the back of the church and spend special time with them. So this is a list of just some of the people that are most likely in your person's life. And when you're making your plan, make sure to list out all of the people in your person's life, what access they have, and what the purpose of that access is. And then you can start redlining people out. And that way you can narrow the field of how many people have access to your child. And remember that this is an area that is very hard to talk about, but the practical conversations that you have with your friends and your families and your support group are ultimately going to keep your family safe, and specifically your person, your teen, your child, or your adult with disability safe as well. I hope you've learned something today. I hope that you have become more aware of the situation that we're living in. As a person with a disability is living with a 3 times higher risk factor of being exploited or being abused. And I'm hoping that you're able to carry some of this knowledge out into the world with you today.